Alright, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Apologies for my voice, I'm a bit congested at the moment again. For anybody who's new, this is generally a podcast, so the screen's not going to change very often. And as always, thank you in advance to anybody who does want to support me. If anybody does, PayPal and Patreon links are both down in the description below and at the top in comment. So for frequent listeners, you remember back close to the start of the year, I made my 2021 loose projections calls video, sort of. There'll be a link to that in the top comment as well. And I had several price and inventory directions indicated, or expectations that I expected to occur this year, and a number of those are already happening a bit faster than I expected them to. So starting off with the precious metals, gold hasn't changed all that much. For the last few months, it was hanging around in the 1800s in dollars per ounce. Now it's dropped a bit under that, down to close to 1780. And gold inventories over the course of 2020, because of, the whole situation that happened during 2020, they built up by a fair bit because jewelry sales around the world collapsed. They dropped by about half. And unlike silver, which is primarily a mega-industrial precious metal, a huge chunk of gold's demand sourcing still comes from jewelry. So jewelry demand collapsed by half, and that allowed gold inventories to build up over the course of the year pretty massively. And even including these 2 months of this year, gold inventories built up by an additional 400% or so, as they started off around 8 million ounces in storage just before the whole 2020 situation started last year, and by the end of 2020 they were up to around 37 or 38 million ounces in storage, and as of now they're a bit higher, up to 39.4. And jewelry sales still haven't recovered. They've recovered a bit, they're not down by half anymore. Instead, they're only down by 40% instead of being down by 50%, but they're still down by 40%, and obviously that's still a huge chunk of gold demand. Now, silver inventories did not build up by anywhere near as large of an amount, whereas gold inventories built up by 400%. Silver inventories built up by more like about 30%. They were down around 300 million ounces in storage at the start of the whole situation last year, and by the end of the year they were up to the 390s, and for the last couple months they've leveled off and have kind of stayed in the 390s. As while jewelry is still a big portion of silver's demand, it's nowhere near the huge chunk of it that it is for gold. So the collapsing of jewelry sales did let silver inventories build up, but again, only by about 30%, as opposed to, multiplying their entire size by several times, as silver is more of a industrial metal in terms of how it's used. Silver is needed for computers and electronics, soldering alloys, mirrors, plating the cages, balls, and or rollers of bearings, electrical contacts, various types of medicine, and now in present day, the major one being for solar panels. And so from a combination of global silver production from silver mines having peaked already in 2015 at around 893 million ounces per year, now falling down to somewhere around 800, and silver consumption being on the rise, especially with solar installation projects, a lot of which are going to be going forward this year, and a lot of which from 2020 were resuming their installation, and thus silver consumption going up and leveling off the inventories. And this has taken silver prices out of the teens and up into the upper 20s, and I'm expecting this year up and over 30, probably a couple times up and down. As of the moment, it's a bit over $27 per ounce. The platinum group metals. Platinum started moving up faster than I expected it to. Back when I made the 2021 Outlook video, it was a bit above $1,000 per ounce. Well, it has since gone up and over $1,300 per ounce. However, for the moment, it's fallen back down. Meanwhile, platinum inventories are presently at 643,000 ounces in storage, and the platinum group metal inventories were able to build up by a decent portion over 2020 because of the prolonged reduction in vehicle manufacturing, because of new vehicle sales falling for a decent portion of the year. So at the start of that whole situation, platinum inventories were down at about 152,000. They got up to about 656 at the highest. They fell back down towards 620. Currently have climbed back up a bit to 643. Palladium was all the way down at only 29,000 ounces in storage, and made it up to now 140, with palladium prices not changing too much since that video, still being in the 2300s, with their primary issues and factors being that most platinum group metals primarily are mined from South Africa, and South Africa has problems. I did a specific video about that a while back. I'll probably put a link to that too. And this year, apart from just the 2020 situation, South Africa continued having problems, only one of which being constant power or electricity failures, which did affect their mine production. Production from platinum group metals has remained relatively flat for the past decade. However, because of those additional issues that popped up last year, platinum group metal production actually dropped year over year. So during 2019, about 227 tons of platinum were mined worldwide, and in 2020, last year, only 210 tons were mined, and palladium experienced a similar production drop as well, whereas in 2019, 186 tons were mined. Last year in 2020, only 170. And while some platinum is used for jewelry, and a bit of platinum and palladium and rhodium are used in computers and electronics, their primary dominant source of demand, by a huge margin, is for catalytic converters for ground vehicles. And so with the reduction in vehicle manufacturing of roughly 15% averaged over the course of 2020, or at least a decent portion of the year, that obviously dropped platinum group metal demand for a time. However, then towards the end, vehicle manufacturing started picking back up, so that started bringing their demand back. And also South Africa started having output problems, and also the amount of platinum group metals required in catalytic converters has only been increasing, as most first world nations have now been implementing higher, more stringent emission standards for toxicity and smog reduction, and now, as of 2019, China is implementing such standards as well. That has raised the required amount of platinum group metals in catalytic converters from roughly, if you bought a vehicle several decades back, only about 3 grams would be in it. Now, it requires about 7 grams. And even aside from just the increasing standards, additional vehicles are still just being added to the total amount in the world every day, as many nations continue to grow and rise, and even first world nations continue having increasing populations. We are now over 1.2 billion personal automobiles on the planet, plus roughly somewhere between 200 and 300 million work and or government vehicles. So, business vehicles, plumbers' vans, electricians' trucks, mail trucks, security detail vehicles, all kinds of everything. So that demand is not really going anywhere, and even as electric versions of those start being made, all that is doing is shifting the metal resource issue over onto different metals. And some other members of the platinum group metal family, rhodium, has broken through its price record once again, now in excess of $23,000 per ounce. After having set its record once at $9,900 back around 2010 or so, and then having broken that in 2019, going up over $10,000, breaking it again in 2020 numerous times, up and over 11, then 12, 13, 14, 15, rapidly jumping up over 20, up over 22, back down, up over 22, back down, now back up over 22 and up over $23,000 per ounce. As the platinum group metals are already not abundant, they are the least abundant of the precious metals. Well, among them, rhodium is really not abundant. And even iridium, Starting off 2020, it was still hanging out around about $1,600 or $1,700 per ounce. Over the course of 2020, most of it being recently towards the end, as some new projects started up. Iridium has now gone up and over 4,000 and is up around $4,300 or $4,400 per ounce. And that's because of some new major movements and projects starting up, mainly revolving around the whole hydrogen economy idea, which for either the production of hydrogen or for the utilization of hydrogen instead of burning it, for the utilization of hydrogen in hydrogen fuel cells. Both ideas require platinum group metals as catalysts and for various parts of the system. Okay, so those ones out of the way. Now let's move on to the more abundant but just as mostly troubled, or soon to be troubled, base metals or industrial metals. The most abundant and least troubled, aluminum. Aluminum inventories built up by a decent part over 2020, primarily because of reduced vehicle manufacturing and a bit because of a halted construction. Roughly a quarter of aluminum is used in vehicle production, and even among that, most of that being for ground vehicles, as well as some halting of construction projects, as a relatively decent portion of aluminum is also used in construction, its biggest thing being air ventilation and ductwork, especially since a lot of it is often up in high places, or even in some buildings straight up like hanging by wire from the ceiling. It typically is preferred to be something light, so aluminum is usually a go-to choice. Also, window frames, the inner structural frame is usually an aluminum frame. You won't typically see it because obviously they bury it behind paint and plastic for aesthetic purposes. But regardless, aluminum consumption dropped for a decent portion of the year for those reasons. And aluminum inventories, which at the time were at around 1 million tons in storage, they built up to about 1.7 or 1.8. Then, as construction and vehicle manufacturing started picking back up in the later part of the year, aluminum inventories started getting drawn back down, and they got drawn back down to around 1.3. Then they jumped back up several times and fell back down, more recently up towards 1.43, and now they've been drawn back down to 1.36 million tons in storage. While aluminum prices have climbed up slightly, they were hanging out around $2,000 per ton or so. Now they're up a bit above $2,100 in futures prices on the market, as things are already starting up and are expected to start up even more so several months from now when those futures would start taking hold. As we mentioned before, many new additional lines of electric vehicles are starting up their production this year, which are, still vehicles, so they still contain a lot of aluminum, and also some more serious ones like electric delivery trucks and electric freight trucks are starting up their production, and obviously several months from now, in the futures time period, it will be spring, which is, the start of construction season for most of the northern hemisphere. That is my cat. She has just arrived and has decided that my time for working is her time for seeking attention. And aluminum was one of the only things whose mine production increased in 2020. Going from roughly 133 million tons of aluminum recovered from the bauxite ore that was mined, up to 136 million tons. Lead, whose major source of consumption, overwhelmingly dominant source of consumption, is for lead acid batteries, most of which I guess you could say are used for ground vehicles. However, a growing portion are being used as industrial batteries, especially for telecommunications, for cell towers and network hubs, so that they can operate in power disruptions. That's why if you've ever been in a blackout but found, as I've seen people finding all the time, that your cell phone still works and you can still text people and even use the internet, but that's why in many places you'll find you still have service and can still do stuff on your phone even when the power is out, still communicate with the outside world, because the cell towers and network hubs around you have a bank of lead acid batteries standing by in the event of a power outage, so they can run and keep giving you service at least until the batteries run dry. So lead demand obviously fell during 2020 with the reduced vehicle production, And lead inventories, which were down in the 60s, climbed all the way up to about 130,000 tons in storage. And then, once everything started back up again, they began getting drawn down and were drawn down to about 91,000. However, recently the inventories got some mine shipments, so now they're back up by a little bit at 96,000 tons in storage. And lead prices have climbed up from around $1,900 per ton up to just under $2,150. And global lead production peaked a bit before silver production did back in either 2013 or 2014. I can't remember which specifically. And it was up around 5.5 million tons, that is, per year. And since then, it has fallen down towards the mid-4 range, the upper mid-4s. 2019 was 4.72 million tons of lead mined. This past year, 2020, experienced a more decent drop. Global lead production fell from 4.72 million tons mined in 2019 to a flat 4.4 million tons mined in 2020. Nickel, whose demand is going to be ever increasing as the electric vehicle revolution continues, as nickel is needed in decent amounts in EV batteries and is going to be needed in increasing amounts in EV batteries as they remove cobalt from the batteries, because most of our cobalt comes from the Congo, where instead of being mined, in modern standards by workers operating massive haul trucks and massive excavator equipment, it is mined by child slave labor. Now, not all of it comes from the Congo, just a huge, decent portion, I think like 60 or 70%, and the removal of cobalt from EV batteries is counterbalanced by the addition of more nickel, and nickel is already needed in huge amounts for production of steel, something that is kind of critical to the existence of modern civilization. It's needed in regular stainless steel, which a lot of surfaces are made out of, especially food handling surfaces, and even your own silverware or cutlery in your house is made of stainless steel. It contains about 10% nickel. Typically, the mixture is 70% iron, 18% chromium, 10% nickel, and the other 2% is primarily manganese and carbon, but it's also needed in greater amounts in coastal infrastructure and all vehicles and things connected with the ocean and dealing with seawater, because nickel is the big saltwater corrosion resistor, whereas chromium is excellent at resisting just water corrosion in general. Nickel is particularly good at resisting saltwater corrosion. And also a decent bit of nickel is needed for nickel superalloys, which are used for things like power generation turbines, as well as aircraft engines. So there's no gap for EV demand to expand into with nickel like there was with solar panel demand and silver in the beginning, because in the beginning with solar panel demand for silver, it was expanding sort of into a gap left by the death of traditional photography, because developing of photos required silver compounds. And as traditional photography was dying, solar panel demand for silver was able to expand into that gap that it left. Now that expansion is over. It's already filled the gap, and it's just going to be ballooning and brushing against all the other sources of silver demand. There is no gap for EV nickel demand to expand into. It's just going to be pushing against other demand sources. So nickel prices are going to be going places, and I expected this year for them to definitely keep climbing from the roughly 16 or 17,000 they were at to at least over $20,000 a ton. I did not expect them to get up towards 20 this quickly, though. They are already up to $19,650 per ton. So they are looking like they're going to be crossing 20, maybe even this week. Those prices rising as demand is picking up from all those new lines of EV production that I mentioned, especially, with the larger vehicle EVs now being manufactured, like electric freight trucks, the Tesla Semi and stuff, and even just regular electric pickup trucks like the Tesla Cybertruck and the Ford F-150E, I think. They require much larger batteries than just regular EVs. So that's going to be spiking up nickel demand, as well as, all the rising nations that are still, building up their infrastructure and everything for everybody. The 2020 situation did put some stuff on hold, but they weren't going to wait forever. So they've, resumed rising and thus bringing their steel demand up with them. So steel production has come back up and resumed growing. So that's also added on to increasing nickel demand, which has nickel prices going upwards. Nickel inventories, at least for the moment, are still holding relatively flat at 249,000 tons in storage, but I really doubt that's going to remain the case. Nickel production fell a bit year over year. 2019, it was 2.61 million tons mined. Last year, it was exactly 2.5. The upward surge in steel demand is also bringing up zinc demand, as a lot of steel, especially for infrastructure, gets galvanized, gets an outer coating of zinc. As zinc isn't a super protector, but it's a pretty decent protector, like upper medium scale, and it's sort of a upper medium tier all-purpose protector. So for stuff like outdoor infrastructure, like signs and traffic lights and bridges and everything that's going to be, exposed to potentially everything, it gets a galvanized coating of zinc. And galvanizing is a huge portion of zinc's demand. I believe it's about half. And so zinc demand has picked back up, along with zinc production having taken a decent drop, dropping from 12.7 million tons mined in 2019 down to 12 million tons mined in 2020, a fair portion of that drop owing to various 2020 related factors, not from zinc actually peaking. So zinc inventories initially went up to about 230 from around, I think it was 110, and they were declining back down into the 180,000s. They got some decent mine shipments recently, and that jumped them up to 294,000 tons in storage a couple weeks ago. However, since then, they've been drawn back down to 280 now. And zinc prices are presently up at $2,866 per ton, whereas they started off the whole 2020 situation closer down to 2,000. And quickly, before we do the last two major ones, some of the more minor or miscellaneous metals. Manganese, after climbing with the steel demand surge up to about 2,500, has sort of remained flat for several weeks, now at $2,540 per ton. Iron, the obviously core component of all steel, was getting up towards its record price earlier back in 2020. It had recently fallen down to the 150s, however now it's been picking back up and is back up over $170 per ton, with its all-time record being about $195, set about a decade ago. And molybdenum, used in various steel alloys, especially in structural steel, molybdenum has continued climbing, at least by a bit, and has gone up from $25 per kilogram up to $26.50. Now, for the last two metals on the list. Copper has gone up to $4. For a decent part of 2020, it had been down around $2.50. However, once the latter part started and things started picking up, construction resumed, vehicle manufacturing resumed, and now, as we hit the start of this year, all these new electric vehicle production lines are starting. Copper prices started picking up, and they've reached about $4. Copper inventories over the course of the year did build up. While a lot of stuff was down for a set of months, they built up from about around 1.2 up to between 1.7 and 1.8 million tons in storage. However, over the last several months, they've been drawn back down as demand has picked up to around 1.3 million tons in storage. And global copper production fell by a little bit, kind of had a flat year, most likely owing to 2020 related factors, as global copper production isn't expected to peak until probably the 2030s. But global copper production in 2019 was 20.4 million tons mined worldwide, and last year in 2020 it was a flat 20 million tons mined. Copper obviously being used, most well known for electric wiring as well as piping, and the major alloying component in brass. And so once construction started picking back up, granted it halted a little bit for the winter, but it's going to pick back up very soon as we approach the spring, and these future prices are for the spring. Obviously, copper demand would be picking back up from electric wiring and plumbing and brass all at the same time. And also, you might be aware, electric vehicles contain way more copper than a regular vehicle does. A regular vehicle is like 40-something pounds, whereas an electric vehicle has, close to like almost 200. I believe it's usually around 183 or so. And the larger vehicles like electric buses or electric freight trucks have upwards of 800 pounds of copper in them. So with all those new EV models starting up their production and the new larger EV type vehicles like, freight trucks and delivery trucks and everything and starting up their production, that's also going to put a surge in copper demand. So, thusly, copper prices are climbing and have reached $4 again for the first time in a while. And lastly, but quickly becoming my favorite, tin. Old reliable tin. Tin is primarily used for soldering alloys for electronics as well as fusing pipes. It is also used as an additive in the PVC material of PVC pipes and is also used as tin plate, plating on the outside of typically steel, but sometimes other metals to protect them, which tin is very good at, as well as also being used in brass alloys and also being one of the major materials in Babbitt alloys for bearings of all kinds, being a key component of indium tin oxide, which is the electric microconducting material that allows flat screens to exist. And it is even needed in solar panels, as well as being needed in its molten form for the rolling production of glass. So, with all kinds of these various sources of demand only going up, as well as the percentage of tin required in brass and soldering alloys only increasing as everybody bans the use of lead in such alloys, tin demand is only going up. And so tin prices over the course of the past year and couple months have gone from around $15,000 per ton all the way up to $26,200. And their highest price in recent market history was around $34,000, I believe, whereas their highest price ever, if you adjust the price for inflation from many decades back, would be equivalent to about $55,000 per ton. From a combined fact of decreasing inventories from increasing demand, as well as reduced supply, because the major supplier of tin is Indonesia. Indonesia's okay, but one of the other really huge suppliers is Myanmar, or you may call it Burma. Well, if you've been following recent news, Myanmar kind of fell apart. Again. And just like Libya's oil production, whenever Libya falls apart, when Myanmar falls apart, it kind of takes its tin mining output down with it. And so, global tin inventories, which usually fluctuate between 5,000 and 15,000 tons in storage, they dropped as low as 710 tons. Very, very recently, for the moment, they're back up at around, I think, 2,700 or 2,800 tons in storage, which is obviously still a decent bit below their minimum threshold. But regardless, that remains kind of a problem. And as I said in that 2021 Outlook video, I did expect tin prices to start climbing up through the various 20s. I did not expect it to just start jumping this fast. And so I have a feeling tin might just break its recent price record. Whether or not, at least this year, it's going to exceed the all-time inflation-adjusted price record, I'm not positive. I would actually say I don't entirely think so. However, I might adjust that if Myanmar/Burma doesn't uncollapse itself. But for the moment, I at least definitely expect it to go up over 30 and probably meet its former recent record. Alright, that's it for this sorry but lengthy video. Thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. Support me if you can. PayPal and Patreon links are both down there. And no matter what, may God bless and protect you all, and I will see you all around next time.